Thanks. I see the first people starting to do that. I appreciate it. I see more people joining the webinar. This is Lester Olmsted Rose with La Piana. We are waiting for more people to continue joining. As we wait, you'll notice in the chat box, which is at the bottom, there's a button at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat function. We are asking people to put in their names and their affiliation just so we know who's attending. So thank you for joining. We'll get started in another minute or two, and please keep adding your names. Great. Our numbers are going up, more and more people joining. Again, this is, sorry for those of you who've been on now, but here we go again. This is Lester Olmsted Rose with La Piana Consulting, and we're going to get started in another minute or two. People are still joining the webinar, so we want to give folks a chance to get on. If you are just joining, please go to the chat function, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. And we're asking folks just to add their name and their affiliation. So we can see who's on and everybody else can see who's on. We're going to start in just probably about a minute here. Okay, why don't we get started? See a lot of people on the webinar and appreciate having everybody here. Good morning, and for a few of you, good afternoon here on the East Coast. We're really happy to have you all join. I am Lester Olmsted Rose. I'm a partner with La Piana Consulting, and this is our webinar on the 7 deadly sins of strategic planning. We hope you like the hellish graphic we've provided for your viewing pleasure. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started and jump into this. First, we want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded, and we anticipate making it available if you find it helpful and want to share with other people. A few other items. Throughout this session, we will be including some questions or encouraging your questions and comments along the way. The best place to do that is a button at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button if you want to insert questions there. We will be monitoring that Q&A function throughout the webinar. We'll monitor those anything you have to put in there, and we'll respond to them either along the way or at the end of the webinar as best we can. So please insert your questions when they come up, and we will respond if we can along the way. We are setting aside a pretty good chunk of time, 10 to 20 minutes at the end of the session for broader open discussion and question and answer. Because there's quite a few people on this webinar, we are limiting this to typed responses. It just helps to manage the flow of question and discussion. So we will be doing that. Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For a few new people who are joining, we are recording this webinar and anticipate having that recording made available to you. Another thing I just want to mention is that throughout the webinar, we have 2 or 3 questions sprinkled throughout the webinar, polls. And when we poll you, you will see a dialog box pop up on your screen. You should feel free to move that box around so it doesn't block something you're looking at. Same thing, I think you're all seeing the video of David LaPiana and me. You can move those videos, those small video screens around or adjust them if you don't want them to block your view of the slides. So again, Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We are recording, polls throughout. You can move the pop-up boxes around. So thank you all for joining us once again. I am Lester Olmsted Rose. I'm a partner with LaPiana Consulting. I'm doing this webinar with David largely because I have been with the firm for 13 years or so, and I touch many, if not most, of LaPiana Consulting strategy development projects in one way or another. So it's a huge part of the work I do. I've worked with probably several hundred different types of organizations over my time as a consultant. So that is what we're doing, and what we're doing it based on some of the principles that are described in the 7 deadly sins. I am just to let you know, the presentation here is it's pretty straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit about strategic planning and why it's important, kind of what's at stake. We're going to go through the 7 deadly sins and how to avoid them. We are going to speak just a little bit at the end just about strategic planning as a process, and some questions and answers about how to move that forward. And then we do just want to refer you to our book on the subject of nonprofit strategy revolution, and we're going to speak just briefly to that. I do just want to reiterate questions and answers at the end. So as we move through this, you can post questions that speak to translating the sins into real life and so forth. So with that, I'm going to introduce David LaPiana, who will move us on here.
Thanks, Lester. Hi, everyone. This is David LaPiana. Just a brief background on what we're doing here. Our firm is celebrating its 20th anniversary, founded in 1998. And as part of that, we issued a 2nd edition of one of our most popular books, The Nonprofit Strategy Revolution. 2nd edition came out just a couple of months ago. It's a complete reworking of this book that's become pretty popular. And in that book, we tried to address the frustration that we see in doing strategic planning as consultants, and that we saw back when we were running nonprofits directly. And we tried to come up with a methodology that would be more useful to people. When this process was initially begun 10 years ago, we had 10 foundations that supported us for 4 years of research, which resulted in the book. We piloted with about 60 different nonprofits from around the US. And we were able to come up with a methodology that we think makes a lot more sense. And we're going to be using that for our presentation today. So start with what's at stake when you're doing strategic planning. Almost every organization regularly undertakes this process. Some probably most dread it, and that's another thing we're concerned about. We think that people should be excited by strategy, not numbed by it. And so we've come up with a process we think is more engaging and more useful. There's a lot of time and effort to bring together board and staff members, and sometimes outsiders, as well as the cost of staff time, facilitation, consulting, all of that. But the biggest thing that's at stake is meaningful results. If you don't do this right, your organization is somewhat rudderless. And so we hope that done correctly, strategy or strategic planning helps the organization to advance. Next slide, Lester. And we're going to start off with a question for you in a poll. What have you found to be your greatest frustration in strategic planning? And this poll question is going to come up for you in a second, and you can click on your answer. And should be coming up any second now. There we go. So you see, just click on here and we'll give you a few seconds to do this, and then we'll report back when we get the results. Meanwhile, Lester, if you can advance to the next slide. Then, so, you know, one of the frustrations that we experience is that strategic planning costs so much in terms of time, money, and effort relative to what people get out of it. And I say this because often when we talk to people about their greatest successes, they tell us that that they did something wonderful, and we ask that that come out of your strategic planning process, and they often say no. That strategic planning seems to be a separate process from making strategic decisions. And that's one of the things we wanted to address. So when we have the poll results, we could show them. Here we go. Let's see. 29% of people feel that the time takes time we don't have, it takes too long, yep. Costs too much, and it's not a priority. 43% say never yields the outcomes we're looking for. Yes, that's our biggest finding of our own, actually. All right, so with that, let's get into the 7 deadly sins and what you can do about them. Lester.
Great, and just a reminder, please go ahead and submit any questions along the way under the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I know you're tired of hearing me say that. So the first deadly sin, which is that oftentimes we mistake goals and strategy. And what we mean by that is that organizations will often set goals saying we are going to accomplish this thing by this time. And that may be a good thing, but that's not the same thing as strategy. With strategy formation, you get something that is bigger, you get something directional. And then the goals tell you what the benchmarks might be along the way. So we define strategy here as, and we've adapted this from some other sources for nonprofit. Strategy is a coordinated set of actions, and it is designed to create and sustain a competitive advantage in achieving a nonprofit's mission. So in pulling this apart, I just like to start at the end. We're all nonprofits. We're all trying to create social good here. And given that, it is all about the mission. But the way we get to the mission is by having a competitive advantage. And we know that that phrase comes straight out of for-profit thinking, but it is equally true for nonprofits. And we're going to talk more about that later. But in short, it means that you have strengths that you can leverage, strengths that differentiate you, make you a strong organization that you can leverage those strengths towards your mission. But strategy, when I think about what strategy is, it really is a set of actions. It is the direction you're headed. It's the way that all the pieces of your organization are coordinated together. So think of strategy in those big terms. Especially, you might hear me on this webinar talk every now and again about organizational strategy. That's really what it is. Goals and strategy are different things, and one sin is replacing goals or using goals to describe strategy. You really need to describe strategy and then make sense of it or begin to chart that strategy with your goals. I always say every consultant has its own or their own pyramid, and this is the Piana pyramid, the strategy pyramid. We think of strategy coming on different levels. So first, there is organizational strategy. You heard me talk about that. Absolutely begins with mission, and it takes into account things like trends, your competitive market, partners you work with, your position, many of those factors. But really, with mission and a description of how you're going to focus your resources and energy within that mission for the highest impact, that is your organizational strategy. And I would say a huge number of organizations either don't have an organizational strategy. They might have great mission statements, but they don't talk about their role or their place within that mission, or they have a sense of that organizational strategy, but have never really articulated it, never really agreed on it. And so we start there. That's kind of the top of the strategy pyramid. Down below that becomes a little more familiar. Organizations need programmatic strategy. So what types of program areas are you going to focus on in order to achieve your organizational strategy? And then operational strategy. How are you going to carry out policies? What systems are you going to create? It can be anything from human resource to IT, any of those support functions, to finance and fundraising. How do those things support your programs and support your organizational strategy? David, anything you want to add to that, or are you ready to move on?
Yeah, just move back to the previous slide for a second there, Lester.
Yeah.
I would just add that the way that most organizations think about themselves is the way this pyramid is constructed. They start with, this is who we are, this is what we do, therefore these are the programs we offer, and then they kind of back into the organizational strategy. When you create a new organization, you always start at the top. What are we trying to accomplish? What kind of programs are we going to offer? Therefore, what kind of infrastructure do we need? And so it's important periodically to recreate that experience and not always limit yourself to thinking about what you can accomplish with the infrastructure and programs you have now, but to use the mission as the touchstone. All right, moving on to the second deadly sin. We often find that nonprofits are interested in pursuing, with this love of goals, we pursue way more goals than can reasonably be undertaken. We often say the most important decision that you make in a strategy process is deciding what you will not do, because there are so many things you can do and they're all wonderful, but you can't possibly do them all. Moving on to the next slide, you can see that in this hypothetical nonprofit that has 3 programs and then all of these other functions, you can have 9 different areas that you need to work in when you're doing strategy. And here's where we get into the goal problem. Go to the next slide. We love to have 3s. And so if we have 3, next slide, Lester. If we have 3 goals in each of these areas times 9 programs, that's 27 goals that we have to pursue. And then, of course, we're being very good in wanting to set up action steps, and then you end up with 3 action steps for each of the goals, and you end up with over 80 different things you have to keep track of. And this is for an organization that's fairly disciplined and only has 3 programs. So you can see how you end up with dozens and dozens of things to keep track of, and we see these strategic plans that are just impossible to implement because you can't monitor them. So we propose instead that you start with an idea we call big questions. Rather than thinking about goals, think about what are the problems or opportunities that you currently see that your current strategies don't address. And they usually come in 3 flavors. There are opportunities, that is something that's opening up for you to do something new or better, and should you invest resources in going for that? That can be a big question. Or a competitive threat, a new entrant into your market, or somebody who has been a competitor who seems to be getting a lot of attention and resources. And we don't mean competitive in a bad sense. You know, we're all in this for the social mission, but you do want to get the resources you need to pursue your work. So if there's another organization in your space that is getting a lot of attention and getting resources, and that feels like a threat to you, that may be something that's a big question. How do we respond to that? Or sometimes there's a business model threat, and that is when everyone who's in your space is having the same problem. And the example I love, because it's from the for-profit world, but it's so obvious, is back when there were small video stores where you used to go out and rent videos, Blockbuster Video came in and put a lot of business with a big box video store. And then they didn't anticipate it, that Netflix came along and put the whole video rental business out of business. That's a competitive threat. You and all your competitors, that's a business model. When you and all your competitors face the same threat. So whether it's an opportunity, a competitive threat, or a business model threat, you need to frame it as a big question to figure out what to do if it's outside the scope of your current strategy. And then the next slide. Here, you need to develop strategic plans that actually contain strategy. When we were doing the research for the Nonprofit Strategy Revolution book, I reviewed dozens of strategic plans from clients and friends. And what was shocking was, as Lester was saying, with all of these goals, that very few of these strategic plans actually contained any strategy. So, Lester, anything you want to add to that?
I don't think so. I do think that we run across business model changes in the nonprofit world, especially with a lot of legacy federated organizations. We work with those a lot, and without naming any names, I think that that's a common question that some of these large organizations that we're all familiar with struggle with. I will name one name just because I think most of the people in the room interact with them, which is United Wages, for example, and their situation and the ways they've tried to move forward in this day and age are well known. They have a core business model challenge. What they were doing 10 and 20 years ago doesn't work the same way today, and they really have to adapt and approach their work in new ways in order to stay relevant. So it's just an example of a good nonprofit business model challenge that requires a really great strategy. Just a reminder, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to drop in questions or comments along the way, and we are monitoring that. So moving on, the third deadly sin, which is expecting strategies to fit within a rigid timeline. And this is something we certainly see fairly often. I'm working with a group of organizations right now that's a great example of this. We're not working exactly on a strategy project, but there is inherent strategy built into what they're doing. It's a group of 3 organizations developing a joint program to address a particular refugee and immigration population in the San Francisco Bay Area. So as soon as I say refugees and immigrants, probably everybody on the call says, wow, how do you do that? So what we all know is that right now there's tremendous flux in how immigrants and refugees are coming into the United States, how many of them are coming in. You may not be aware, but you could imagine that there's a huge amount of flux in the federal funding, which drives most of that work. So these 3 partners are walking this funny balancing act between saying, look, here's a population that's here now and has been coming in recently, so we need better programming for them. We need to respond to their needs on the one hand. On the other hand, we have to develop this in a way that we recognize that everything we think is true for our organizations today could change in a month. It could change in 3 months, and it could change back. So they need a strategy that is responsive to the trends in the field, but is not time limited. If they say that they're going to do something and they're going to do it for the next 5 years, they will be doing the wrong thing. We can all see that in that example. So really, we need to build strategies that are not set on a rigid timeline. Typically, people look at strategic planning and they think 3 years. Sometimes you might say 5 years. What we know is in the world now, even when you're not working on immigration issues, we know that it's just impossible to anticipate how the world is going to change around you. David was talking earlier about trends and things like that that you need to respond to. So thinking about a strategy that describes where you're focusing, the direction you're going in is really good. Setting some goals that might be a little bit shorter term, 1 year or maybe longer, but with the expectation that you're going to shift that goal is a really good idea. You can do yearly checkups and so forth. So I am curious from you all. We want to do another, oops, I clicked the wrong thing. I want to do another poll here. We're really interested in how often your organization does strategic planning. So that poll just popped up on your screen. While you are marking this to let us know how often you engage in strategic planning as an organization. I'll just mention one of the ways I think of this is that a mission, your organizational mission, should be very durable. A mission changes from time to time, but not often. Your organizational strategy should be a little less durable. So we're headed in this direction. You don't necessarily want to change that every morning when you wake up. But it does need to change. You need to see what's changing around you, and you need to adapt to it. So organizational strategy is somewhat durable, but very changeable. Then you begin to move down to goals. They become much more changeable and adaptable as new information comes in. And then when you get into the deep planning and implementation planning, many organizations do that annually. That, of course, makes sense. I'm a huge fan of doing an annual plan, but with 3 to 6 month review and revise built into it, so that you expect to continue looking at the world around you, making adaptations, learning from the first steps you take to implement a strategy, and being ready to revise, learn from what's happening around you, what you're experiencing, and be willing to revise it. So kind of move from very durable, something that lasts a long time, to things that change very often. And between that mixture, you're on a good road. Let's see how you all voted. How often do you engage in strategic planning? So that's interesting. Almost 40% do it every 3 to 5 years, very regularly, routinely. Some people do it when your current plan needs to be refreshed. That's a pretty large number. So you kind of look at where things are and refresh it. You do annual plans and not multi-year plans. I think I just spoke to that somewhat. So, and I did just have a potential client just call me just this week saying, we need a strategic plan because our funder's asking for it. So nobody chose that. So other choices there. So you do get the sense that a plurality of the folks on this webinar do, in fact, try to plan your strategic planning process periodically. And it's not that that's necessarily wrong, not at all, but it does mean what we encourage you to do is to be open to reviewing, revising, and stepping into it at a different timeline as needed. So I'm going to there's a couple graphics here that illustrate this. This one really shows you this is the traditional planning process. You do a whole bunch of planning, and then you spend a whole lot of time putting it into place. So that planning might include some of the, reviewing the field, looking at your resources, thinking about looking at a SWOT traditionally, and then you do it for 2 or 3 years. And then you go back to planning on a cycle. What we really encourage organizations to think about is something that looks much more like this. You do some thinking and strategy development, or reviewing what's going on in the field. You put it into place, you implement, and then you step back and say, what's working, what's not working, what's changed, and do we need to make adjustments? And then you make some of those adjustments, put them into place. And again, look again and say, well, we made those adjustments. How are they going? So it's much more of this ongoing review and revise, do, review, revise kind of a process. This works when you develop a strategy framework, or what I was calling earlier, organizational strategy, that can be easily adapted and updated to reflect reality. And again, you heard me talk about this before. I'm just going to say it again quickly for emphasis. When you have an organizational strategy that describes your direction, then you can do that much more adaptive up and down review, revise process along the way. An example of this is I'm working with a number of rural and remote food banks right now, and some of them are looking at, as a strategy, they serve the local town very well. And the question is, as a strategy, how do we move into the remote or the more rural areas where there's a huge need for food, but it's a much different proposition about how to get food out. So their strategy is to do X, Y, or Z, like work with the schools to provide more food, because almost every family touches a school in one way or another. So if that's their strategy, that's something, if your strategy is to work with schools, you can put that into place over time. But which schools, where you get funding, How you do it with the schools might be more volunteers, might be more staff, might be more school staff training. There's a lot of different ways to do that. That can change a lot while you get the right action while you're working on an overall strategy. David, anything you want to add?
No, that's great. Let's move forward. We can come back to some of this.
Right.
So the fourth deadly sin is confusing strategic planning with consensus building. How many times have we heard people say, we need a strategic planning process so we can get everybody on the same page? And while that's a noble sentiment, and of course it's important to get everyone on the same page, let's not confuse the two. If everyone agrees on the wrong thing, that's not really going to help. The key is to identify the right questions and get the right answers, and then to bring people together through the process that gets you there. The drive to consensus in many nonprofits paralyzes decision making. There's a great love of democracy in our sector, which is wonderful, but sometimes those who lead need to point the direction, engage people appropriately, and make sure that the right questions are being asked and hard answers are being arrived at. And we have a tool we've come up with that helps with this, which we call strategy screen, which is on the next slide. A strategy screen is a very simple tool to make your decision-making criteria explicit before you have to make the decision. We came up with this because we recognize that humans are really good at justifying our decisions after the fact. We shoot from the hip and then we come up with some justification for why that was the inevitable or the only answer we could have come up with. So we say at the beginning, when you're tackling one of the big questions that I talked about earlier, make those criteria explicit. And this could be a short list, 8 to 10 criteria that you're going to test any of your answers against. Challenge your thinking and to weigh choices. It's not a rigid straitjacket kind of a thing, a checklist that you have to follow. But if you say, for example, any decision that we come up with must advance our mission. It must strengthen our competitive advantage or what differentiates us from anyone else. And we insist those two are in any strategy screen. But beyond that, it might be something like it must pay for itself or break even, or it must be doable within our resources, or it must be something our current staff have the skills to carry out, or something the community would support, or something that advances equity. There are a variety of things that might be situation specific. You come up with those in advance. It really does help then when you go through weighing different options. We see people have a discussion and we say, why don't we pull out that strategy screen? And we see that one or more of the options actually fits better to the screen that was created in advance. And then the next slide, just to sum this up, consensus should be a byproduct of a good strategy process, but it's not an end in itself. The process by which you engage people should start with having everyone understand that there is a problem and kind of digging in on that problem. And that's why you're creating a strategy process, not because 3 years have passed, but because there's something that your current strategies are not addressing, something that you need to address. And then the engagement around that problem will lead to engagement around the solution. And we hope that that will get you where you need to be. Lester, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just one example of this way of thinking, kind of good decision making. I worked with an organization several years ago, large organization, lots of government funding, and they knew that their government funding for their field was going to steadily decline year after year. It had been a trend and it was going to continue to be a trend. One of the things they did is use a strategy screen to really take a hard-edged analysis of the work they did and to define what it is that they do that is core to the mission that they were going to fight to the end to protect and to really keep strong. And through that process, they were a large organization. They had 10 program areas, and they selected, before any crisis was present, they identified 3 program areas that really were not core to them. And so they made this very interesting strategic choice and very positive strategic choice. We are going to focus our resources on our core work. that's most germane to our mission, and these three areas don't fit into it, we are going to responsibly transfer that work in other ways. And one program was very complicated. It took them actually several years to transition it to another organization. By thinking ahead, by using a strategy screen or these decision-making criteria, they were able to create a decision, articulate the reason for that decision, and to put that decision into effect as a really powerful strategy. So the next deadly sin, forecasting is forecasting the future from a snapshot in time. And so we do have to be careful with that. What's happening today is always more powerful, I think, than thinking about the broader picture, kind of where you've come from and where you're headed. It's also usually more accurate, so there's a propensity to do that. But one of the things that happens with information gathering is that people tell us about us what they think we want to hear or what they want us to do. And it's not as rigorous of a process to get information about who we are as it could be. So that's exactly something to pay attention to. An environmental scan, well, actually, let me go back here. When I think of gathering information around this, it's best, David said this, we want to start with what we know or what the question is. And so often a strategic planning process starts with a very broad environmental scan that's really early in the process, and you're just looking for any information at all about your field. The results to that, as we say here, can be either too broad or too shallow. What it means is it means you get all this information about a lot of extraneous things, and sometimes not enough about what you really need. And so we like to think about knowing what your questions are first, as David talked about. Once you're clear about the questions you're focused on, then a strategy screen or criteria-driven approach helps you define the information that you need to make a good decision. Then you are not too broad and you are not too shallow. And this third bullet point here is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that if a consultant does this work for you, it means that as an organization, you're not building the muscle of looking at the world around you, scanning different places to get data, doing a good analysis of your own data. It's really important to build some of that way of thinking in-house as an organization. So that's one thing that we think is important. And the other thing I'll say is it's really expensive to hire consultants to do this kind of scanning for you. So it's in your self-interest oftentimes to learn how to build this in as an ongoing information gathering and looking at the world around you to build that in-house. The types of things that are really helpful for people to look at are just trends in general. So local demographics, national demographics, political trends, all these things make sense. Technology has really set a lot of nonprofits on head over heels these days. And all of these things, collaborative work going on, social work, all these things change over time. So it's really good in your field to scan for these things on an ongoing basis. And then it's also really important to look internally to what data you collect. A lot of organizations serve people directly. Make sure you understand and look for trends. Don't just look for what's happening this month or this year. Look for how those trends are changing over time and maybe interacting with those external trends. So as I said before, this kind of continuous scanning helps you make sense of the environment. But what's really important is the underpinning to really strategic thinking. I'm going to move on in a minute. I did just want to quickly respond to one question that somebody had in the Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A button. Just when we were talking about strategy and kind of keeping your planning flexible and responsive to the changes around you, there is a balancing act. There's a question here, thank you for asking, about extreme volatility in the world around you sometimes. And sometimes you need multi-year approaches and investments. So those things are good. We would never say don't build for the future. Absolutely, you need to do that. And hopefully the way we spoke about this before helps speak to that balance. If you know the direction you're going in, then you can make some long-term investments. There's always risk with longer-term investment with a good strategy screen, so good criteria driving your decision, with good clarity about your long-term direction. If that's underpinned with good data about trends and what's going on in your field and in your community, those things will help you make a solid decision for long-term investments. Where you can, you want to keep adjustments. You just know that you are going to need, even with a huge capital campaign or building a new building and things like that, your needs are going to shift. And so building in flexibility wherever you can is important. So hopefully that gets to some of that. David, anything to add?
No, that's great. I was going to answer that question then. Glad you took it. Let's move on to the next, the sixth deadly sin, which is pretending to be objective. Sometimes when we gather data, the act of gathering data makes us more confident of that data and of our analysis of it than maybe is warranted. We're all human. We bring our own sort of outlook, prejudices, preconceptions to the table. And so we need to remember that and not overread objectivity into the data that we do collect. And so that on the next slide, one of the things we want to talk about with you is the limitations of SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This has long been something I have felt is far less useful than we think it is, and is far too broadly relied upon in the sector as part of strategic planning. In fact, sometimes people refer to strategic planning as doing a SWOT analysis. And what is a SWOT analysis? You create that grid and you have strengths and weaknesses on one side, opportunities and threats on the other. The problem is that with the strengths and weaknesses part, they're almost always the same. Every organization that we go to seems to tell us the same thing. What's a strength? Well, we have a terrific staff. We have, 30 years ago, we did some great thing. And what's a weakness? We don't have enough money. And it sort of goes on in that theme. And after you've seen this many, many times, you feel like maybe that's not all that useful. On the other hand, the opportunities and threats tend to be more specific. And so we like to focus on that opportunities and threats side of the SWOT analysis rather than on the strengths. But just take it with a grain of salt and think about other ways of getting at the organization's current situation as opposed to the SWOT analysis. The next slide. Market awareness. One of the things we think that's helpful is to understand who else is in your market, who else are people providing services in your community or field, however you think of that market, and take a more benevolent approach than we sometimes take in these analyses. The general approach I see from clients is, yeah, there are all these other groups in our field, but they don't do a very good job. We're the only ones who do a good job, or we do a better job, or they don't know how to do this or do that. There's kind of a undervaluing of others and holding ourselves up as exceptional. And so my advice is always to try to understand more and judge less, and to be more objective about where we stand in that marketplace. What do others do differently and perhaps even better than us? And the questions we have on the next slide can help with that. Your competitive advantage, you want to ask, so first, who else is there? Where do they excel? How are they better than you? Where are we strong? And where are we possibly different and better than others? So when you think about who else is out there, you can ask yourself, who does exactly what you do in the same places you do it? Those are your direct competitors. But you might also ask, who meets the same needs we meet in a different way? And there are with innovators, different approaches that people take that might undermine your entire business model, not just be a direct competitor. You want to keep track of that. You also want to know where they excel. A great exercise is to get your team together, identify, if there's 4 of you, identify one each, 4 of your competitors. Go out with the assignment of coming back to make the argument of why they are better than you are. And this changes that dynamic I was talking about earlier. It asks you to really look at what's best about these other groups and helps you to see, your own weaknesses relative to them. And then once you've identified what sets so competitive advantage is what you do differently and better. It's not enough to be different, it has to actually be better than others. And it's very hard to come up with this, but it's the most powerful concept in nonprofit strategic planning, is that of competitive advantage. Once you've identified either an actual advantage, something that you do better that's different than your competitors, or something you're working toward, which is more often the case, we're trying to evolve this differentiation, then what you want to make sure is that everything you do as an organization enhances that differentiation and doesn't tear it down. And it helps you to be able to monitor your performance, to keep in mind that the choices you make in the strategy screen, even in the way you frame big questions, should be about enhancing that competitive advantage. Lester?
Great, thanks. The only thing I would add to that is if you had just one criteria for what to do, you should do things that advance your mission, that leverage your competitive advantage. In other words, do more of what you do best. I want to be really clear. That doesn't mean keep doing what you're doing now. It means take the strengths that allow you to succeed in what you're doing now and figure out how to apply them to best meet your mission. So final deadly sin, frustrating staff, and really everybody through bad data, inaction, or both. So, we've been talking about this. There's a trio of problems that we need to pay attention to. One is, we've talked about over-reliance on under-reliable data. That's one. Another one is time delays that put the organization on hold. And the third is that staff and volunteers might get really frustrated when they need to act on the strategies. So a lot of the things we've talked about seek to address all of those issues. The question really is nicely captured in this cartoon. It is easy to be indecisive by needing information or by having so much information that it's not clear what the decision ought to be. And we talked a little bit about that before. So good data is important, but good data does not always yield good strategy. Bad data makes it even less likely to get to good strategy. Know how much and what types of information you need, and connect the information you need to the action you're deciding about. And again, that all starts with good questions, good criteria that drives the answer to your question, and then putting those together. We are going to go to, I'm going to skip over this for a moment. Let's go to the poll. Just curious, how long did it take folks to complete the last strategic plan that you worked on? So we're going to fill that out. And while you are looking at that poll, I'm going to go back then. Typically, we hear from a lot of clients that they may take up to, anywhere from 6 to 12 months for a strategic planning process. It really depends on the type of organization. I want to emphasize again what we spoke about before. Strategic opportunities don't wait. And so one of the challenges with doing strategic planning is, on the one hand, you need to know what direction you're headed in, what your priorities are before you move some things forward. On the other hand, if you're tied up in a process for too long, you're going to miss opportunities or fall behind. So you don't want your organization to be paralyzed with the planning process, or as we're talking about now, the information gathering. So that hesitation can be really dangerous for the organization. So just out of curiosity, let's see how long, let's see the poll results. It looks like this is well spread among the choices. Both, so some of those medium length times, as well as some that are faster and some that are longer. So I think we've described this well. Just for what it's worth, the more stakeholders involved, the more information you need, the deeper planning you need as opposed to strategy development, Those are things that drive a longer process. Oftentimes, larger organizations need more of those things in order to get to their answer, or to build support for those answers along the way. Thanks for that. So one of the things just to speak about, and this is a direct issue that touches on bringing staff along, and we have a question and answer, which I'm going to also get to in this. When a process goes on for a long time, by the end of the process, people are exhausted. So you always have to keep in mind, everybody on this call I know has experienced this. The executive, the board, the staff, they're engaging in a strategy and development process. And in doing that, they're still doing their day-to-day jobs. So it's like an add-on for most of those people. If that process goes on and on and on, they're just sick and tired of it by the end, and they don't want to do anything else. But actually beginning the implementation and moving that forward, that's when things really start. So it's important to keep that in mind. You try to move quickly, get to good decisions with the right amount of information so that things can start. A strategic plan often does make too little difference, as the bullet says, in the day-to-day life of an organization. One of the ways, and this speaks to the issue of staff either not coming along or not being involved. For each organization, this is very different, but one of the ways to keep a strategy and planning process relevant and the decisions relevant is how you go about doing it. So there are a few key tools for this. One is the right level of stakeholder involvement. I cannot tell you what the right level is. It's, in my experience, it's based on the culture of the organization. But think about when and how do we bring people in. Just make sure when you're bringing staff in, you are bringing them in sincerely, where you know what your questions are and you know what information they can provide that will help you make a better decision. If you bring them in insincerely or as kind of tokenism to make sure they have a voice, it's more likely to go bad. So that's a piece of advice around that. The other tool that we've offered is this idea of a strategy screen. That guides you to the right information. Those criteria guide you to better decisions that are intentional. They also make it much easier to communicate why you're doing what you're doing, because you've really intentionally and explicitly described why you got to the decisions you got to. So David, anything? Oh, sorry, I should just say that another thing to build in is putting some of this informally, the things you do, putting the language of your strategy into your staff meetings, into your board meetings, putting some of your decision-making criteria or strategy screen into everyday use. Those things help you to live it day by day. So David, anything else?
Well, I think there were two questions that I think that are relevant here. One is how you get buy-in from staff if you're not going to get to consensus, or at least get a broad understanding of where you're trying to go. And the second is the role of culture in strategic planning. And there may be different cultures within subcultures within an organization, particularly, if you have different sites. And so, what we suggest there is a process that starts with a strategy team that is made up of stakeholders from different parts of the organization. And this will be different from every organization. One might be very board heavy, and another might be staff heavy. But making sure it's not just the senior management folks, that you get people who know what's going on in the organization at other levels engaged as well. Sometimes, depending on the culture, that can be a large group within a smaller team that meets like on a regular basis on the phone every week to move the process forward, and the bigger group is kind of a reflection body. But what you want to be doing is, taking the temperature along the way so that you don't just produce something at the end and it's a shock to anyone. There should be participation, opportunities to have your voice heard at every step of the way. But that will vary based on culture. And there are some cultures where conversations go on and on and on, and you need to make it clear that we're consulting here, but there is going to be decision making at the end. So anyway, so that was my comment on that, Lester.
I just want to go back to, we just have a few minutes for Q&A, and people have been putting in some questions. Again, there's a button at the bottom of your screen for that. I just wanted to respond to a couple of these quickly. One question here is about financial modeling as part of the strategic planning process. What I would say is that this is a longer conversation, but in short, financial modeling is important depending on the amount of risk and financial risk to what you're doing. So again, I would never say there's a one-size-fits-all. Loosely speaking, if you're doing something that has high financial risk or that is a newer direction, like starting a whole new program, even if you know everything about how to put that program into place, but it's new, that's when you really want to do some financial modeling, or at least some basic budgets or identifying your key financial assumptions so you can monitor them during implementation. If you are not doing a radical change at the end of the process, you might need less financial modeling. I would never tell you none, but you might need less. So it's really adapting that. The principle that we have been speaking about is get the amount of information that you need, and you do that by knowing what your questions are, what's driving your decisions, and then making sure you have the information to match that. I want to jump to one other question that's on here really quickly. The organization chooses strategy as opposed to the outside consultant. So there is a brand of consulting where people will come in, they will do a whole lot of analysis for you, and they will tell you what you're supposed to do. And I'm not a fan. When we work with clients, we want to partner with people. We can help with some of the information gathering. We spoke earlier about some of the advantages for organizations to be doing a lot of that and building that muscle, building that capacity. But ultimately, if we tell you what to do, the chances that you will think it's wrong or won't work for you or seems like a beautiful idea, but whatever, are really high. So we really believe in partnership, where we bring our expertise about nonprofit management, about process, and we bring that to your knowledge of your field and your operations. And we think that for broad strategic choices, generally a board of directors owns those decisions, broadly speaking, with staff input, and especially the executive director. And for the implementation planning, broadly speaking, generally, staff owns those decisions, sometimes with the board weighing in or providing some guidance.
Lester, could you put up the next slide? And I want to address just a couple of these questions as well. This question, a question about financial modeling, and as Lester was talking about this, I realized, we're talking about strategic planning, and what that question gets at is the need for business planning. And every business planning process starts with strategy, but sometimes if there are very intense economic or operational questions, you need to go through a business planning process, which is an intensely analytical process to figure out scale, timing, costs, over a period of implementation. So that's a distinction we make. And in fact, we have another book called The Nonprofit Business Plan, which addresses that. And I just wanted to make sure we discuss that. And then, the question about strategy versus goal setting, and that goal setting is important. We do not advocate not having any goals. What we realize, though, is that goal setting is an operational planning process. So you come up with your strategy. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And over the next year, how are we going to get there? That's where the goal setting comes in. It's the annual planning and the review and the building that into individuals' work plans and reviews, and that gets presented to the board. So it's very important, but you need to start with strategy, what we're saying, and we did not mean to imply that you would never get to setting goals. Lester, you have any of these questions you wanted to address?
I could. There's a whole bunch here. I could get on my soapbox and go on about. I think we're nearing the end of our time. I just put our email addresses up, so if folks want to follow up with either David or me, we're happy to respond if you send us an email. So that's what I'd say. Back to you, David.
Okay. Well then, thank you. Thank you all for spending an hour with us. We know this was a very high level, very fast moving coverage of a very complex issue. And you can find more information on our website, read one of our books, or as Lester said, we've got our emails here if you want to ask a question. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye.